One of the interesting things about Plato in general, before just maybe thinking about the Gorgias in particular, is just how amazing Plato is as a writer, that he's basically a marvelous phenomenon in the history of, I think, philosophy, literature, historical writing. And as far as his style is concerned, it's one of the things that really impresses me is just how hard it's been to have someone sort of give this kind of philosophical literary writing, right? So that other people have attempted to write philosophical dialogues. But really, if you look at the history, Anselm attempts, Augustine attempts, Iris Murdoch attempts, any number of people. And no one just seems able to do what Plato does. And part of it, I think, is just the style is so fascinating and interesting. Part of it is also there's a multi-level accessibility kind of going on, and where a number of important and interesting topics intersect in very subtly composed and intelligently visioned ways. The Gorgias in particular, like many of the dialogues, is concerned with education, is concerned with one's place in the city, and obviously is concerned with a philosophy in orienting all of that. The title is named after one of the sophists who's visiting Athens. His name is Gorgias. And in the background of this is this whole sophistical, not really a tradition, but sophistical influence in the city. That you have these men who are going around and they're promising a kind of education that's going to make people expert, make them better, in such a way that their lives will be better. Now, the background of this partly is this Homeric paradigm of what makes one excellent. Well, it's excellence in speech and excellence in action. So, for example, the great men in the Iliad are both good at giving speeches and they're good at fighting. Or if you think about the Odyssey, and we see how Telemachus, part of his growing up journey is he has to learn how to speak publicly in front of the men of the city, but he also kind of goes on his own little minor voyage/adventure because that shows he's becoming a man of action. He's leaving the household, can enter the sphere of great action. And so greatness in speech, greatness in action are the sort of marks of at least a kind of Greek excellence. And the sophists, in some ways, are offering an excellence of speech, right? And the idea is if you become good at speaking in this way, you'll be good at ordering the affairs of your household, you'll be good at ordering the affairs of the city. And at least if you're not doing personal great action, you're sort of ordering the great actions of the city. So it's sort of an excellence of speech and an excellence of action, political action at least. Now, all these Athenian men, let's say, are sending their sons to the sophists to receive this education, because the sophists are going from city to city, sort of like, I don't know, contemporary educational consultants. And they're like, send your young men to us, we will make them excellent, and then they will go and have flourishing and excellent lives. But there is a huge question as to, well, what does excellence in speech, excellence in logos actually look like? What is it? And so then you have a potential sort of conflict between the sophists and Gorgias, who seem to propose a vision of speech where excellence is the power, and so this notion of power, power to persuade, power to convince, because presumably if you have the power to persuade people, it means you can move their souls and therefore order what they do. And obviously in politics and in the law courts, this is super important. But then you have the philosopher who's going around, and unlike the sophists, for example, he doesn't charge for, so Socrates does not charge for his ministrations. But his ministrations are also weird. It's not clear what position he actually officially has relative to all the apparatus of Athens. But he seems to have a different vision of what excellence in speech looks like. And so you have, I think, fundamentally this meeting between Gorgias and the representation of the sophistical kind of, not really a real tradition, but an influence in the city, and then Socrates, who's also an influence in the city, but not exactly positively seen by everyone. And in some ways, because philosophers keep asking uncomfortable questions, they are the sorts of people who are comfortable asking uncomfortable questions, even in a political space. And so, the city might not find such a destabilizing influence or agent something that's good, even though Socrates is going to present himself as it were, the true statesman or the true political actor, as the one who has the good of the city really in view. So we have this meeting between Gorgias, or what he represents, what Socrates, what he represents, and the way just the first two kind of opening lines or the opening exchanges of the Gorgias between Callicles and Socrates sort of frame this really well, because Callicles basically says, you've come too late to sort of see the fireworks and the battle. And Socrates goes, oh, you mean I'm late to the feast? And this image of speech as conflict and wrestling, and then this image, counter image of speech as maybe a kind of shared feasting and delighting, is sort of in play throughout the whole Gorgias. And the context is, well, what does this have to do for education? Because a lot of education, even today, presumably, right, is learning how to speak. That we go into these educational institutions of ours and we become sort of up to speed, ideally. We get initiated into traditions of speaking and thinking so that we learn how to sort of come to mature opinions, let's say, and learn how to offer our mature opinions. And if this gets done well, we learn how to lead and govern our own lives, and then as we come into responsibilities in family life and in political life, how to lead and govern our families and our cities. So in a way, the Gorgias is asking the question that I think personally all young people are asking, right? What does it mean to kind of come into maturity, and so that you can take responsibility for your life and for the lives of those who sort of depend on you. But it's put it in this sort of tinderbox of this debate between, well, is speech really about power and how to influence people, or is speech about this other thing Socrates is proposing? And the thing that Socrates is proposing is this sort of philosophical attitude. And this philosophical attitude, however, one of its characteristics is a willingness to lose in a conversation, okay? And that part of maturity for Socrates, and as you go through the various interlocutors that Socrates engages in the dialogue, as they talk about the nature of education, the nature of leadership, fundamentally, the nature of politics, the nature of law, there's one side of people who just really do not want to look bad. They want to dominate Socrates rhetorically. And he's like, well, I have another vision of what it means to be educated, and I have another vision of what it means to be a leader. And part of that means a sort of willingness to admit when one is wrong and admit and receive correction. And this debate, I think, is a debate that young people face continually. It's a debate that I think faculty continually sort of kind of go back and forth about as to how much of our work is about trying to propose and defend our positions, and how much of our work is actually attempting to come to a right understanding and a mature understanding of things. And so this drama between this part of us that wants to have things right and sometimes gets defensive when we have to sort of feel like we want to defend and protect what we think is true and good. And then this other part of us, which is sort of more radically truth-seeking, such that it's willing to burn things down and let things go, which is sort of just dangerous in politics, having that kind of energy around without a kind of maybe moderation to it. So the Gorgias has all of these questions, I think, that young people are facing about what education is about, what life is about, and it is dramatized so well between Socrates and then Gorgias and Gorgias' sort of followers and clients or disciples. And these questions, I think, touch every young person who wants to do education. I think they're the questions that are interesting to anyone who's coming to the Hertog Fellowship, especially the political program over the summer, the politics program. And like, we're trying to figure out, like, what are we doing with this thing that is life? And human beings who are distinguished, at least among all the other animals on the planet, for being able to speak, then what does it mean to do this human thing, speaking well, relative to our politics and relative to our sort of self-ruling and self-directing. So part of the charm of Plato's literary writing is he's clearly someone who is aware of the literary tradition of the Greeks. So there are all these Homeric tropes and tragic tropes, and he's kind of drawing these in. But he's also offering to his audience, and also to us, often historical figures from recent history in Athens, recent to him that is. And because people who know these people and know that these characters have reputations, he wants to sort of leverage these so that he can kind of manipulate them and use them towards his own ends. But again, in that sense, he's not doing something entirely original, because even before him, right, the tragedians, when they bring in their characters, they're using sort of tropes and figures that are known in the general consciousness. But even when Aristophanes, who's a comedian, writes The Clouds and has Socrates as a character, right, he's using Socrates because Socrates is known, right? So in some ways you could think of Aristophanes as a kind of Saturday Night Live kind of writer and figure. And he's going to sort of take the gossip of the day, and he's going to take the big characters of the day and then write them onto his stage. Now, Plato doesn't have like the literal stage, obviously, but he's writing in the dramatic form, right? And so he wants us to see characters come into sort of clash with each other and into meeting with each other. And part of the reason why he's doing this is, at least to me, Plato is what I like to call a paradigmatic writer, in the sense that he loves using images. He loves using paradigms. He loves, because images are ways in which he can quickly sort of concretize a position or concretize a view or make something intelligible that's kind of complicated. And he does this in many ways, right? So he has, for example, paradigms, say, for how Socrates acts in the city. So Socrates is the gadfly, or Socrates is the midwife, or Socrates is the numbfish, or the torpedo fish. So these images, right, allow us sort of to get visions of what Socrates does or how Socrates is received in the city. So there's paradigms for action. There's also paradigms or images for just ways of thinking. So like Socratic interrogation is a paradigm of how to interrogate, how to question, how to think, which we have now received, right? Even in this 21st century, we hear Socratic interrogation. That brings a bunch of associations for us. We sort of understand different people better and worse, that there's a certain way of doing things, and we sort of receive that. Okay, so there's paradigms of just how Socrates acts, there's paradigms for how he sort of thinks and the methods that he has, but there's also just paradigms for characters, like character types. And that's why I think Plato sort of uses historical figures a lot of the time, not all of the time. Some I think he just sort of makes up by himself, which is kind of interesting because he makes them really, again, sort of just memorable. But I think what he's doing is he wants to sort of raise them from being merely historical figures to being paradigms of, again, ways of thinking and ways of sort of meeting with thought. Because in the philosophical drama that Plato is giving us, he wants to show that the adventure of reasoning and the adventure of truth-seeking is not like a cold calculation. We're not just working through logic proofs and syllogisms or something, but Plato is incredibly sensitive to how, when human beings think, we are motivated in our thinking. We are motivated by our hopes, we are motivated by our fears, we are motivated by our pieties, right? The things we care about, the things we feel that we owe something to. And in various ways, the different characters in the dialogues are sort of paradigms of different positions or paradigms of different ways of thinking. So we kind of come to understand, for example, that To be a Thrasymachus is a certain way of entering into conversation. To be a Callicles is a certain way of going into conversation. To be an Alcibiades is a certain way of relating to philosophy. Because Plato writes these figures, he sort of raises them from being, as it were, historical agents to these sort of more literary just models of how people engage with the quest for truth. But again, allows us as the readers and as the conversants to kind of test ourselves against these figures. Because really, what Plato is trying to show is different ideas and different ways of thinking are attractive to different sorts of people. And so as you go through the dialogue, which is just a very complicated puzzle box, as you're going through it, one question you should have is, what am I being attracted to? Which figure, which position, what idea, what way of kind of thinking am I attracted to? Or is sort of kind of a mirror of who I am, maybe not in a flattering way, because Plato is trying to sort of show us who we are, right, as thinkers and as speakers. And in the Gorgias, we have some really delightful and interesting figures. So Gorgias actually doesn't speak for too much of the dialogue, so he's sort of like the occasion for what's going on. And he's, I've said briefly already, so he's our sophist. And what we see with him, so one of the kind of the big opening question in the Gorgias is like, who is he, sort of asked, right? We should go and ask Gorgias who he is. And there's an attempt, it seems, to sort of link what Gorgias does and who he is, like his art of rhetoric, and his art, and who he is. And there's a way in which Plato and Socrates are trying to push this idea between like someone's art really shapes in important and significant ways who they are, and Gorgias claims that he can make people better, that he can make them excellent, that he wants to make them good, that he is not asleep or indifferent to the question of whether or not he's making people good. But once pressure gets put on him as to how, in fact, is he making people good, all of a sudden there's trouble, okay? But then he leaves the conversation kind of very quickly because his students and his followers sort of come in to take the space to kind of defend him. And there's two sort of principal speakers after that. The first is Polus, and Polus is really fascinating because you get to see a bunch of rhetorical strategies that are deployed so as to sort of show that, you can teach rhetoric in this sort of value indifferent way where you just have these techniques of persuasion, and if you can sort of pass them on effectively, you've kind of done your job. And it doesn't matter if the person is without a conscience, doesn't matter if they're sophistical, doesn't matter in all of these things. And what happens is you see Polus sort of appeal to a number of rhetorical strategies. He tries to ridicule Socrates and kind of sort of laugh him down. He tries to kind of subtly threaten Socrates. And so this brings up, right, again, like, what does it mean to appeal to laughter? What does it mean to appeal to force in a kind of space of speech, right? And is that legitimate speech? But Polus is just not good enough to face Socrates in kind of interrogation and in conversation. And so Socrates sort of forces Polus to sort of make certain concessions that Polus is forced to retreat, and this brings in the major speaker, who's Callicles. And Callicles takes on the strongest version of really human life is about wills, the contest of wills, that my interests versus your interests, my power and force versus your power and force. And these things that we call laws, and these things that we call agreements, and these things that we call sort of the niceties of rules of engagement in dialogue. All of these are simply ways that weak people have come up with so that they can control the strong people. And so this is where it all comes up. In a way, Callicles shows what happens when Logos is no longer controlled by this interest in the pursuit of and discovery and disclosure of truth, but Logos really is at the service of moving interests forward. Okay, and if that's the case, then the question becomes, well, then why should one listen to it if one has, say, other means or other kinds of power? And so you start with Gorgias, who thinks that, he seems to think incoherently, though, that what he's doing is going to make people good in some way, right? And maybe it's just politically he has to say that. But as the interlocutors sort of escalate, okay, so then Paulus comes and is like, no, Gorgias is naive, but then he's forced to agreeing to something that probably shouldn't agree with. And then you get Callicles, who sort of escalates all the way, okay? But again, because Callicles basically says, well, if my own personal interests are all that matter, he kind of ends up in what seems to be a strong hedonist position. But Socrates chases him far enough to forces him, and I will not give any spoilers, into admitting that he can't be like a purebred hedonist because there are certain pleasures that he thinks are beneath him. And Socrates uses some tricks, and again, it's good for us to ask, are all the tricks that Socrates uses legitimate? Okay, just because, and this is the beauty of Plato, just because Socrates does something doesn't mean it's actually a good thing. It doesn't mean it's actually a legitimate thing. Some of the things Socrates does, I think, are open to interrogation, are open to questioning. And so we go through this whole nest of complicated and fascinating and funny, okay, because there's a lot of laughter in the Gorgias and funny exchanges about what place does Logos have in ruling and leading human life, both personal and political? And what happens when Logos breaks down as this sort of ruling and leading power? And we see the threat of that in a way with Callicles, because if the Callicles thing is let to kind of go all the way. But then we do all of that. But then we have just a kind of fantastical ending where Callicles sort of falls out because at a certain point he realizes he can't keep talking to Socrates, and then to sort of kind of complete the sort of literary mishmash that you find in the Gorgias, because there's historical things going on, literary things going on, philosophical things going on, and then Socrates concludes with a really fascinating myth. Okay, and so we have the tragedians present, we have epic present, we have comedy present, but then it sort of culminates in mythology. Okay, and again, this makes us ask, what is this relationship between mythology and Logos at the end, and then mythology, therefore, and the city? That do all cities need some kind of political mythology to have their political Logos sort of hang together and be sort of understandable and receivable by the people? Because not everyone has a philosophical understanding of what the city is and what the city does. So you kind of have a complete microcosm of the various ways that Logos functions in the city, right? We have poetry, philosophy, historical things being referenced, we have mythology, and we have all of these, even though the Gorgias is not like a super long dialogue like say, the Republic or the Laws. So it's just an amazing achievement of how dense it is, given how many things are covered in just such a very efficient amount of space. Okay, yes, and I think that is the real question, right? Why would one spend one summer doing more reading? And for the Plato readers, it's even doubly sort of ironic, maybe, is because Plato is famously a critic of books and famously a critic of reading. So here's my pitch. So obviously, the Hertog program is a fantastic program of close reading. And you get to spend these moments of intense focus And honestly, and the reading is the occasion of the real activity in my mind. And this is just me speaking as a Plato guy, okay? That for Plato, really, speech and logos is going to come sort of most alive when it is done live, right? It is done in speech. And you want them to have those really amazing, wonderful conversations. You want people who've done the reading and are enthusiastic about the reading and want to think intelligently and maturely about it. That it's not enough just to sort of say, I've read Plato. Plato would never be satisfied with that. The dialogues are not written such that one just reads Plato and says, I've read Plato. No, the dialogues are written to provoke conversation. They're written to provoke questioning and thought and more pursuit. And the Hertog, I think, program is sort of special in that sense because it is a collection of people who are kind of crazily devoted to thinking that, yes, these questions about life, about education, about how to direct one's personal life, how to direct our political life, these are questions that require careful, slow, kind of reading that leads to careful and engaged conversation. In these sorts of conversations, right, you get to do a number of things. You get to sort of receive the perspectives of other thoughtful people who are excited to be there. And to me, in that kind of conversation, what is happening is actually you're not just reading as an individual, but we're now reading as a community. And that kind of communal reading is so important because a new kind of reading happens, okay, where it's a rereading fundamentally. Because all of a sudden things you didn't see and things you didn't notice are kind of brought out by someone else because we all bring different interests, we all bring different backgrounds, and the dialogues are written in such a way that different things hit different people, that every rereading is a valuable reading. And so all of a sudden, right, in these conversations, we get to see the dialogues really come alive, right, in the way that they're meant to come alive. They're not meant to be just kind of slaved over by oneself, kind of lonelily, as it were, but they're meant to be read with other people and in discussion with other people, because fundamentally, I think for Plato, it is in conversation that not only do we disclose ourselves, but we also sort of define ourselves. That by learning to be in conversation with other people, we learn actually how to sort of engage in logos appropriately and to seek it appropriately. And so in my mind, these weeks with Hertog are special in that sense because a very rare bunch of human beings have been brought and have been given the leisure to say, for, say it's the Gorgias, right? For this week, this is what our conversation is going to be about. We will not have distractions. We will not have, and we're not even the distraction of assignments, okay? Because people here in pure freedom, okay? People who want to be here, faculty who want to be here. Faculty always joke that grading is what we get paid to do. A bunch of this we would just do for free. And I think Hertog is like, in many ways, a paradigmatic occasion of sort of the free community of letters, the free community of logos and discussion and pursuit of truth, where we're here freely and we want to enjoy each other's company freely, and we want to seek the truth together freely, which means we can change our mind freely, we can be wrong freely, we can learn new things freely, and that's, I think, what Hertog sort of allows, right? It's a special community, it's a special kind of piety towards the tradition, where we are saying this is worth our time, this is worth our minds, because we think that there are treasures here. And again, with Plato, it's like we don't know what the answer is in the sense of there's an answer at the back of the book, or that I'm hiding behind my back, that I'm just sort of at the end of the day showing, oh, by the way, here's the answer. But it's rather that the truth is such a powerful and interesting and potent thing that no one is going to have it as a human being in its entirety in this sort of safe way that I possess it, but rather it's those of us who have been possessed by the search for truth can come together for a special time and a free time and do this together in community and in friendship, and with mutual respect. And I think that's a special thing.